The trick manipulators use that nobody noticed. The invisible psychological game. There is a strange moment many people experience in relationships. Nothing dramatic happens. No yelling, no insults, no obvious manipulation. And yet, somehow you walk away from the conversation feeling confused. Your confidence drops. Your certainty disappears. And without realizing it, you start questioning yourself. This is the first sign that a psychological manipulation trick has already been used on you. And the most disturbing part is this. The manipulator rarely raises their voice. They rarely threaten you. Instead, they quietly change how you see reality. Most people imagine manipulation as something loud. Lies, gaslighting, aggression. But the most dangerous manipulators use something far more subtle. They manipulate your interpretation of events. Carl Jung spent much of his life studying the hidden mechanisms of the psyche. And one of his most important discoveries was this. Human beings rarely experience reality directly. Instead, they experience their interpretation of reality. This is where manipulation becomes almost invisible. Because if someone can control your interpretation, they control your experience. And once your experience is controlled, your decisions follow automatically. The manipulator does not need to force you. You begin to cooperate with them without realizing it. The hidden battlefield of the mind. Most manipulation happens in a place people never notice. Not in words, not in actions, but in the psychological frame of the conversation. The frame determines who looks guilty, who looks reasonable, who feels responsible, who feels defensive. If someone controls the frame, they control the outcome. Let me give you an example. Imagine you confront someone. You say, "Why did you lie to me?" A normal conversation would focus on the lie, but a manipulator rarely answers the question directly. Instead, they respond with something like, "Why are you always assuming the worst about me?" Now, the entire conversation has shifted. It is no longer about their behavior. It is about your character. This subtle shift is one of the oldest manipulation tactics in psychology. And most people miss it completely, because it does not look like manipulation. It looks like a normal emotional reaction. But the moment you start defending yourself, the manipulator has already won. You are now inside their psychological frame. And once that happens, the conversation is no longer under your control. The real goal of the manipulator. Manipulators are not trying to win arguments. They are trying to win psychological positioning. They want you to feel one thing above all, uncertain. Because uncertainty is the gateway to influence. When people feel certain, they resist. When people feel confused, they seek guidance. And manipulators position themselves as the one who provides that guidance. This is why many manipulative conversations follow the same pattern. First confusion, then doubt, then emotional pressure, and finally compliance. The person being manipulated believes they made their own decision. But the psychological path that led to that decision was carefully engineered. And once you see this pattern, you begin to understand something unsettling. Many people who manipulate others do not even see themselves as manipulators. Because in their mind, they are simply protecting their own image. Carl Jung warned about this when he spoke about the shadow. The shadow is the part of the psyche that hides uncomfortable truths about ourselves. And when someone refuses to confront their shadow, they often project their darkness onto others. Instead of facing their own dishonesty, they accuse others of mistrust. Instead of acknowledging their own mistakes, they accuse others of being difficult. This is how manipulation becomes psychologically invisible. Because the manipulator genuinely believes their version of events, and when someone truly believes their own distortion, it becomes extremely convincing. But the real trick manipulators use is only beginning. Because the most powerful manipulation does not attack you directly. It slowly reshapes your perception of yourself. And once that happens, the manipulation no longer needs to continue. You begin doing the work for them. The frame shift that controls your mind. There is a moment in many conversations when something subtle happens. You start the conversation with a clear point. You know what the issue is. You know what happened. You know what you want to address. But a few minutes later, you are no longer talking about the original problem. Instead, you are explaining yourself. Defending your tone, clarifying your intentions, and suddenly the person who caused the problem appears calm, reasonable, even slightly wounded, while you feel emotional defensive, and uncertain. This is not an accident. This is what psychologists call a frame shift, and it is one of the most powerful psychological tricks manipulators use. The frame determines reality. Human conversations are not just exchanges of information. They are competitions of interpretation. Every conversation has an invisible structure. A frame. The frame answers 3 hidden questions. Who is reasonable? Who is emotional? Who is responsible? Once those roles are established, the rest of the conversation unfolds automatically. Manipulators understand something most people never realize. You do not need to win the argument. You only need to control the frame of the argument, because the person controlling the frame controls the story, and the person controlling the story controls how others interpret reality. How manipulators shift the frame. Let us look at the moment where the trick usually happens. You raise a concern. You point out a problem, something they did, something they said, something that hurt you. Instead of addressing it directly, they shift the frame with a single sentence. Not by denying the event, but by questioning your reaction to it. You might say, "Why did you ignore my message yesterday?" And they respond calmly, "Why are you so sensitive about everything lately?" Notice what just happened. The original issue was their behavior, but the frame is now shifted to your personality. Now the conversation is no longer about what they did. It is about who you are, and most people fall into the trap immediately. They begin explaining themselves, defending their feelings, trying to prove they are not sensitive, not paranoid, not overreacting. But the moment you start defending yourself, you have already lost the frame, because now the manipulator is the judge, and you are the one on trial. Why this trick works so easily? This tactic works because human beings have a deep psychological need to be seen as reasonable. We want others to see us as fair, rational, emotionally stable. Manipulators exploit this instinct. They provoke you emotionally, then question your emotional reaction. And when you react, they use that reaction as proof that you are the problem. This creates a psychological loop. The more you defend yourself, the more unstable you appear, and the calmer they remain. The more credible they appear, the conversation becomes an illusion, because the real issue has completely disappeared. You are now trapped in a performance where you must prove your sanity. And manipulators are extremely patient during this stage, because they know something powerful. Once someone starts defending themselves, they stop questioning the manipulator. The psychological reversal. This technique is sometimes called intentional misinterpretation. You say something simple. They twist its meaning. You try to clarify. They twist your clarification again. And slowly you begin to feel something disturbing. You begin to doubt your own communication. You begin wondering if you explained things poorly, if you were too harsh, if you misunderstood. This is where manipulation becomes dangerous, because now the manipulator does not need to continue controlling the conversation. Your own mind begins doing the work for them. Your brain tries to restore social harmony, so it searches for ways you might be wrong. And once this process starts, reality becomes unstable. The conversation is no longer about truth. It is about perception, and the manipulator is guiding that perception. The silent power of calmness. One of the reasons manipulators appear so convincing is their calmness, but their calmness is not accidental. It is strategic, because in social psychology, calmness signals authority. When someone appears calm while you appear emotional, observers automatically assume the calm person is more rational. Manipulators know this instinctively. They remain calm even when they are responsible for the conflict. They provoke emotion, then contrast it with their own composure. This creates a powerful illusion. The illusion that you are unstable and they are reasonable. And the more emotional you become, the more convincing their performance becomes. The real trick nobody notices. The real trick manipulators use is not lying. It is redirecting attention away from their behavior toward your reaction. Once attention shifts to your reaction, your credibility becomes the focus, your tone, your mood, your personality. And when the focus is on you, the manipulator disappears from responsibility. Like a magician guiding your eyes away from the trick. The manipulation succeeds because you are looking in the wrong direction. But the most disturbing part of this dynamic is still ahead, because the final stage of manipulation is not confusion. It is something far more powerful. A psychological state where the victim begins to self-police their own behavior just to avoid conflict. And when that happens, the manipulator no longer needs to manipulate. Because control has already been internalized. When manipulation becomes invisible, there is a moment in many toxic relationships when something strange happens. The manipulation stops. At least, it appears to stop. The arguments become less frequent. The manipulator becomes calmer, even cooperative. And yet, you begin changing your behavior. You become more careful about what you say. You hesitate before expressing concerns. You start monitoring your own reactions, not because anyone told you to, but because you remember what happens when you don't. This is the final stage of psychological manipulation, when control no longer needs to be enforced externally, because it has already been installed internally. The birth of self-censorship. The human brain is designed to avoid emotional pain. Whenever a situation repeatedly leads to stress, conflict, or humiliation, your mind begins searching for ways to prevent that pain in the future. Manipulators rely on this instinct. They do not need to dominate every conversation. They only need to create enough emotional discomfort that you begin adjusting yourself. Maybe they mock your concerns. Maybe they accuse you of overreacting. Maybe they twist your words until you feel embarrassed for speaking. After enough experiences like this, your brain learns the lesson. Not consciously, but emotionally. The lesson becomes, speaking up leads to problems. So the next time something bothers you, you hesitate. You think, maybe it's not worth mentioning. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe it's not a big deal. And in that moment, the manipulator has already succeeded, because you are now doing their work for them. The internalization of control. Carl Jung often warned about a psychological process called internalization. It happens when external authority becomes an inner voice. At first, the manipulator questions you. Then gradually, you begin questioning yourself. You start hearing their voice inside your own thoughts. You're too sensitive. You're overreacting. You're imagining things. And eventually you do something dangerous. You stop trusting your perception. This is the psychological turning point. Because once someone stops trusting their own perception, they become dependent on someone else's version of reality. And manipulators are more than happy to provide it. The quiet erosion of identity. The damage caused by this process rarely happens all at once. It happens slowly, almost invisibly. One small compromise at a time. You stop mentioning certain topics. You avoid certain conversations. You soften your tone to avoid accusations. You filter your emotions so you don't seem dramatic. At first, these adjustments seem harmless, but over time, something deeper begins to change. Your identity becomes smaller. Your voice becomes quieter. Your instincts become weaker. Because every time your perception conflicts with the manipulator's narrative, you suppress it, not because they forced you to, but because you want peace. And manipulators understand this better than anyone. They know most people value harmony more than truth, so they simply make honesty feel uncomfortable enough. That silence becomes easier. Why intelligent people fall into this trap? Many people assume manipulation only works on weak individuals, but the opposite is often true. Highly thoughtful, empathetic, and intelligent people are especially vulnerable because they constantly question themselves. They analyze situations from multiple perspectives. They try to understand the other person's intentions. Manipulators exploit this openness. When confronted, they introduce just enough doubt to trigger your analytical mind. And once your mind begins analyzing, it begins justifying. You consider their stress, their past, their struggles, their emotional wounds. And before long, you are defending the very person who is manipulating you, not because they convinced you, but because your empathy convinced you. The moment of realization, eventually, something changes. For many people, it happens after a major betrayal. For others, it happens after years of subtle discomfort. But the moment always feels the same. You suddenly see the pattern. You realize the confusion you felt was not random. The doubt was not accidental. The shifting conversations were not misunderstandings. They were psychological strategies. And the most unsettling realization appears. You were not losing arguments. You were being moved out of the argument entirely. Every time the topic shifted to your emotions, your credibility, your personality, the manipulator was removing themselves from responsibility. And once you see that pattern, you begin seeing it everywhere. The true power of awareness. Manipulation depends on invisibility. The moment the mechanism becomes visible, it begins to lose its power, because manipulators rely on one fundamental advantage. They know the psychological game being played, while the other person believes it is just a normal conversation. But when you recognize the pattern, something powerful happens. You stop defending yourself. You stop chasing explanations. You stop trying to prove your intentions. And suddenly the manipulator faces something they cannot control: silence, clarity, and awareness. Because the greatest threat to manipulation is not confrontation, it is recognition. Once someone sees the psychological game, they can no longer be moved by it. And without control over perception, the manipulator loses the only weapon they truly had: the conversation ownership trick. One of the most subtle tricks manipulators use is something most people never detect. It is called conversation ownership. This is not about arguing. It is about controlling where the conversation goes. Most people assume conversations move naturally, but manipulators guide them like a chess player moving pieces across a board. Imagine you confront someone about something specific. You say, "Why didn't you show up yesterday?" A direct question, a clear topic. But watch what the manipulator does. Instead of answering directly, they respond with something like, "Why do you always assume the worst about me?" Now the conversation has changed. It is no longer about their behavior. It is about your attitude. And suddenly you feel the urge to explain yourself. You say, "I'm not assuming the worst. I just wanted to know." But it's too late. The conversation is no longer under your control, because the manipulator has taken ownership of it. And once someone controls the direction of a conversation, they control the emotional outcome. Why this works so well? Human communication is not only about information, it is about social positioning. When someone asks a question, they temporarily hold authority. But manipulators refuse to stay in that position. They immediately redirect the spotlight from their actions to your behavior. And once the spotlight moves, the psychological roles reverse. You become the one explaining yourself. They become the one evaluating you. The emotional distraction. Another variation of this trick is emotional distraction. Instead of addressing the topic, the manipulator introduces an emotional story. Suddenly they are talking about stress, or past trauma, or something painful from their life. This tactic is called strategic vulnerability. It creates empathy, and empathy makes confrontation uncomfortable, because once someone appears emotionally wounded, it feels cruel to continue pressing them. So you soften your tone, you change the subject, you reassure them, and the original issue quietly disappears. The manipulator's secret. Manipulators understand something very important about human psychology. Most people want harmony more than resolution. They want peace more than truth. So when a conversation becomes emotionally complicated, most people retreat. But manipulators stay calm, because confusion works in their favor. The illusion of truth. There is another trick manipulators use that slowly changes how people think. It is called the illusion of truth effect. And it is surprisingly simple. Repetition. When people hear something often enough, they begin to believe it, even if it is not true. Manipulators repeat certain phrases over and over again. You're too sensitive. You're always overthinking. You're misunderstood. You're imagining things. At first you reject the idea, but over time, something strange happens. Your brain begins to treat the repeated message as familiar, and familiarity feels like truth. This is how manipulators slowly reshape someone's identity, not with a single lie, but with repeated suggestions. The psychological erosion. This repetition does not only affect how you see the manipulator, it affects how you see yourself. You begin questioning your memory, your emotional reactions, your judgment. And once someone doubts their own perception, they become vulnerable to influence, because now they are searching for someone else to define reality, and the manipulator is ready to step into that role. The silence weapon. One of the most powerful manipulation tactics is also the quietest. Silence. But this is not ordinary silence. It is strategic silence. Manipulators suddenly withdraw emotionally. They stop responding. They become cold, distant, unreachable. This tactic is often called the emotional timeout, and it creates a powerful psychological reaction. Humans are extremely sensitive to social rejection. When someone suddenly withdraws emotional warmth, the brain interprets it as a threat, so the victim begins searching for the cause. Did I say something wrong? Did I upset them? Should I apologize? The manipulator does not need to accuse you. Your own mind does it for them. Why silence is so powerful. Silence creates uncertainty. and uncertainty is psychologically unbearable. The human brain is wired to resolve social tension quickly, so people often apologize just to restore harmony, even when they did nothing wrong. And when that apology happens, the manipulator regains control without saying a single word. The third-person trap. Another manipulation tactic is called triangulation. This happens when a manipulator brings a third person into the conversation. They might say, "Even Sarah thinks you're overreacting," or, "My friends all agree you've changed." Suddenly it feels like you are outnumbered, even if those people never actually said those things. Triangulation creates social pressure. It makes you feel isolated, and humans are deeply uncomfortable being socially rejected. So many people adjust their behavior just to regain acceptance. But the third person may not even exist. Sometimes the manipulator invents the support completely, because the goal is not accuracy. The goal is influence, the mirror defense. There's one response manipulators hate more than anything: reflection. Manipulators rely on emotional reactions, but when someone calmly mirrors their behavior, the psychological game collapses. For example, if they twist your words, you calmly repeat their statement back. If they accuse you unfairly, you ask them the same question. If they push emotionally, you respond with calm curiosity. This is called a mirror defense. And it works because manipulation requires asymmetry. The manipulator acts, you react. But when you stop reacting, the structure breaks. They lose their advantage. The emotional vacuum. Manipulators feed on emotional energy, anger, defensiveness, fear, confusion. But when someone removes emotional reactions completely, the manipulator loses data. Psychologists sometimes call this the emotion vacuum. You remain calm, neutral, unreadable. This does not mean suppressing emotion. It means refusing to display it in a manipulative environment. Because public emotion gives manipulators information, and information gives them leverage. The final realization, the most important truth about manipulation is this: manipulators do not control people. They control perception. They shift conversations. They create doubt. They redirect attention. They provoke emotional reactions. And all of it serves one purpose: to control how you interpret reality. But once you understand the patterns, something changes. You stop chasing explanations. You stop defending yourself. You stop playing the psychological game. And when that happens, the manipulator loses the one thing they depended on: your participation. Because manipulation cannot survive awareness. And once you see the trick, you cannot unsee it.